Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 729, and today is December 17th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of important news on the Middle East to get through on today's show, but first want to remind people to subscribe to the all-new Kyle Anzalone show. It's my high production show that I'm putting out at least once a week, and we will be recording an episode later today, so be sure you subscribe to the show. That way you get that episode. It is the first link in the show notes page, so wherever you're listening right now, head on over, go ahead and click that top link, subscribe to the page. It's going to take you all of about 20 seconds, and then finish watching this episode of Conflicts of Interest. Let's get into it. First up here, this one is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Trump suggests he could end U.S. supported long-range strikes in Russia. So President-elect Donald Trump suggested at a press conference at Mar-a-Lago on Monday that he could reverse President Biden's decision to support long-range missile strikes on Russian territory. Trump said it was a big mistake for the Biden administration to greenlight the escalation without asking him what he thought. When asked if he might reverse this decision, the president-elect said, "I might, yeah, I thought it was a very stupid thing to do." The comment marks the second time in recent days that Trump expressed his concerns over the long-range strikes that Ukraine has launched using U.S. ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles. In an interview with Time magazine that was published last week, Trump said that he vehemently disagreed with Biden's decision. The Kremlin noted Trump's comments and said that Russia agreed with the president-elect. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said at the time, "The statement in itself is fully in harmony with our position, that is, our visions of reason behind the escalation coincide, and of course we like that." Biden signed off on long-range strikes in Russia despite Moscow making it clear the escalation would risk nuclear war. In response to the step, Russian President Vladimir Putin formally changed Russia's nuclear doctrine, which lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. At his press conference, Trump also said that the Ukrainian President Zelensky should be ready to make a deal with Russia to end the war. He should be prepared to make a deal. That's all. Too many people are being killed. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is as we talked about recently, two Trump officials, Mike Waltz and Keith Kellogg, who are going to hold very significant positions in the incoming Trump administration. Waltz will be the national security advisor, so he'll be taking over Jake Sullivan's role, and that's partly significant because his position will not need any approval. He's an advisor, so that's just an appointment by the president, and so Waltz will slide into that position nicely, and he has said that kind of against what Trump just said right here, that he worked with Sullivan, his quote, hand in glove, when the Biden administration decided on this policy, and said that the Trump administration was in support of it. Additionally, Keith Kellogg, the retired general, also said that he supported this idea, and that was Trump, and that is the man that Trump is nominating to be his envoy to the Ukraine conflict. And so with these two people who are going to have a lot of say over Trump's Ukraine policy, it's interesting that we had these comments for Trump, but as I say on this show, personnel is policy. And so I think that, if Trump is appointing these people, it's likely that even if he disagrees with their policy, that ends up being what's implemented, particularly Kellogg, who is the envoy, who's going to be representing the United States to the Ukrainians, to the Russians. If he's on board with this, I think it's probably unlikely that Trump ends up getting rid of it once he comes into office. All right. Next up here on Gaza, Israeli attacks killed 52 more Palestinians in Gaza over 24 hours. So the Gaza Health Ministry said Monday that Israeli attacks killed at least 52 Palestinians and wounded 203 in the previous 24-hour period as the daily U.S. bat slaughter continues. On Monday, the strikes included an Israeli attack on the Shati refugee camp in northern Gaza. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, the strike killed a group of civilians, killing at least 4. Wafa also reported that 5 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli strike on Bet Lahia, a northern city that's been under total siege since early October as a part of Israel's ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign. In the central Gaza, the Nusra refugee camp, at least 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli bombing. Later in the day, a young girl was injured by strikes in Nusra, succumbed to her wounds, and died. Dr. Hassam Abu Shifa, the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Bet Lahia, said in a video that messaged that Israeli snipers were targeting the hospital staff. He said anyone moving within the hospital wards was at risk of being shot, creating a very dangerous situation for both patients and staff, he explained. A day earlier, Israeli strikes on a school sheltering displaced Palestinians in the southern city of Khan Yunis killed at least 20, including women and children. Israeli strikes on Sunday also killed an Al Jazeera journalist and 5 rescue workers. The health ministry said Monday that the latest violence brought the recorded death toll from October 2023 to now to 45,028, and the number of wounded to 106,962. The ministry has mostly only counted dead and wounded Palestinians who have been brought to hospitals and morgues, and its figures do not account for the Palestinians who are missing and presumed dead under the rubble. The director of the Palestinian NGO network told Al Jazeera that the real death toll is likely higher, much higher, because thousands of people are either under the rubble, missing, detained, or killed. We have concerns about the number of people will even increase more since the civil defense teams cannot reach the bodies under the rubble, they explained. In October, a group of American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza estimated in an open letter to President Biden that the U.S.-backed onslaught in Gaza has killed at least, this is a minimum, 118,908, a total that includes indirect deaths caused by the Israeli siege. A doctor who led the letter told antiwar.com in a recent interview that estimate was the bare minimum they came up with by looking at the data. And so, of course, that means the real death toll is higher. Now, we're hearing again that there may be a potential ceasefire hostage deal in Gaza. Israeli and Hamas officials say hostage deal is close. So, according to reports on Monday, both Israeli and Hamas officials have said they feel a hostage deal that would involve a temporary ceasefire in Gaza is close to being reached. Israeli media reported that Defense Minister Israel Katz told Knesset members in a closed-door meeting that a deal with Hamas was, quote, closer than ever. A Saudi news outlet reported an unnamed senior Hamas official also said that a deal was closer than ever. A Lebanese newspaper reported there is unprecedented readiness on both sides to reach an agreement. The details of a potential agreement are unclear, but the optimism comes after Hamas reportedly conceded to 2 major Israeli demands, agreeing that IDF troops will be able to remain in Gaza and handing over a list of hostages it will release. According to the Wall Street Journal, the potential deal may involve a 60-day ceasefire. During that time, Hamas will release 30 Israeli hostages, including U.S. citizens, and Israel will release Palestinian prisoners and allow more humanitarian aid to enter the Strip. While there is no sign Israel is considering permanently ending the genocidal war, the senior Hamas official speaking to Saudi media said the Palestinian group's proposal involved a gradual end to the war and a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces according to an agreed upon timetable and guarantees from international mediators. Another source familiar with the negotiations told the Saudi outlet that Hamas was aware that President-elect Donald Trump wanted to see a deal before his inauguration. Trump recently issued a threat to Hamas saying there would be all hell to pay if the hostages weren't released by his inauguration. The president-elect also repeated that threat on Monday, saying, "As you know, I gave a warning that if these hostages are not back home by that date, all hell is going to break out." The source said, speaking to the Saudi outlet, Hamas and the resistance are ready for a hostage deal, but the problem lies with the occupation. Previous negotiations to reach a deal were sabotaged by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a widely acknowledged fact by Israeli officials and media. In November of 2022, the two sides did reach a deal, which resulted in the release over 100 Israeli hostages and the exchange for over 200 Palestinians. Now, one thing to add to all of this, of course, is we'll see what happens once any deal is agreed to. It may very well be that the Israelis don't live up to their side of the agreement. Next up here is an article that I wrote for the Institute on December 16th. Assad issues first statement since fleeing Syria over a week ago. Former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad released a statement that detailed his final movements in Syria before fleeing to Russia. Assad and his family left the country after an al-Qaeda-affiliated forces overran Damascus. So this is from Assad's statement, and it, I believe, was just printed in text on Telegram. I remained in Damascus, carrying out my duties until the early hours of Sunday, 8th September 2024. As terrorist forces infiltrated Damascus, I moved to Lakita in coordination with our Russian allies to oversee combat operations. Upon arrival at the Yemen air base that morning, it became clear that our forces had completely withdrawn from all battle lines and that the last army positions have fallen. Assad said that the Russian base he was at came under attack, forcing him to flee the country. Quote, as the field situation in the area continued to deteriorate, the Russian military base itself came under an intensified attack by drone strikes. With no visible means of leaving the base, Moscow requested that the base's command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the evening of December 8th. So the Syrian war, beginning in 2011, has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Syrians as regional and global powers have entered the conflict to achieve their own interests. Since the fall of the Islamic Caliphate in 2019, the battle lines in Syria froze with Assad control of the major cities, the al-Qaeda-affiliated forces under Turkish protection in the north, and the Kurdish forces under American protection in the east. Additionally, Assad's forces remained subject to frequent aerial strikes from Israeli and U.S. bombardment. Washington placed strict sanctions regime on Damascus as well, aimed at preventing the rebuilding of the war-torn nation and destroying the country's economy. Assad's government, weakened by external forces and corruption, was unable to withstand an offensive launched by the al-Qaeda-linked Tahrir al-Sham, aided by Turkey and Ukraine. It appears that Assad's army was largely unwilling to fight and fled in the face of the terrorist forces. HTS was able to conquer many of Syria's largest cities in less than 2 weeks. In the statement, the deposed Syrian leader said that part of the reason his forces crumbled so quickly was the false information that he fled Damascus prior to his evacuation. As terrorism spread across Syria and ultimately reached Damascus on the evening of Saturday, 7th December 2024, questions arose about the president's fate and the whereabouts. This occurred amidst a flood of misinformation and narratives far removed from the truth, aimed at recasting international terrorism as a liberation revolution for Syria. And we have certainly seen that take place over the past couple of weeks, or week, as the West has celebrated al-Qaeda's victory in Syria. So, what's going to happen with the Russian bases? This one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com explains, after Syria regime change, conflicting reports on Russia's pullout plans. So while the sudden regime change in Syria affected numerous regional powers, few face as much disruption as Russia. During the Assad era, Russia maintained very important Mediterranean bases in Syria, including Tartus, Russia's only Mediterranean naval base. With Assad gone, what's going to happen to the Russian assets? Reports are conflicting. Today, a new report quotes unnamed sources saying that in the wake of the takeover by the Islamist Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS forces, Russia intends to withdraw all of its forces, including those from major bases along the Mediterranean. Russia hasn't publicly announced that is the case, but it has begun removing troops and equipment from some of over 100 military sites in the country. Troops have been withdrawn from positions in southern Syria and elsewhere in the country. About 10% of Russia's presence in Syria has reportedly been removed in the last 2 days. Over the weekend, conflicting reports suggested Russia was pulling back, not pulling out. From Syria, there were further reports that Russia was in talks with HTS about keeping at least its 2 major bases in Syria. Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov appeared to confirm those ongoing talks. Russian officials have also been quoted as saying there have been no decisions yet on the future of their bases in Syria. Whether or not Russia intends to fully withdraw from Syria in the next 30 days, it is scaling back considerably. Returning to full use of its bases will greatly depend on working out a deal with HTS. That may be easier said than done. The HTS used Ukrainian arms during the offensive that led to its power grab, and the group has been courting Western approval despite its history and ideological ties to Al-Qaeda. HTS's internationally backed installation in Syria likely came with the presumption that Russia would not be allowed to remain. In the meantime, reports are that Russian troops are still in Syria, are short on supplies. As these claims came from Ukrainian intelligence, however, it's not clear that they are accurate, and we're going to really see what happens over the next couple of weeks in Syria if the Russians will remain. Also, this one from Jason on the future of Syria. U.S. effort to extend SDF ceasefire with Turkey in northern Syria fails. So, with the 4-day ceasefire in the Syrian city of Manbij coming to a close, U.S. mediators' efforts to convince Turkey to make it a permanent ceasefire deal have failed. The expectation is that fighting between the U.S.-backed SDF and Turkey and their allies will likely resume soon. Last week, there was major fighting over the city of Manbij. The 4-day ceasefire was meant to allow Kurdish fighters and their families to withdraw from the city as Turkey and their allied factions are looking to reclaim the area. An SDF spokesman said that the U.S. attempted to extend the ceasefire deal with Turkey, but it failed because of Turkey's evasion on key points. Those key points were reportedly a desire to withdraw more Kurdish civilians from Manbij and question about the dispossession of the remains of Salutama Sal. So the SDF and the Kurdish Red Crescent were trying to bring vehicles into Manbij to allow them to evacuate more people, but they were prevented from doing so by the Turkish-backed militant forces. The remains of Suleiman Salah are a touchy matter in the region. Salah was the grandfather of Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. He died in the 12th century. His tomb at Karzakak on the Syria-Turkish border, but his remains were relocated in 2015 because of the threat of ISIS taking the area. They were taken just north of the village of Ashumi by Turkish forces. The location to Ashumi was initially reported to be temporary, and Kurdish forces have offered to help facilitate their return to the Karzakak tomb. Turkish forces have been unclear, however, on whether they will intend to return the remains or will simply make the new place the new resting site for the remains. With the Manbij ceasefire now over, Turkey has reportedly been bringing major reinforcements to the area around Kobani, including heavy weapons and armored vehicles. Kobani is right on the Turkish border. Only about 35 miles from Manbij. This will likely be a staring agent area for new fight against the SDF over Manbij and the surrounding area. Turkey isn't the only one that has their sights set against SDF control in Syria's northeast. Syria's new defense minister, Hassan al-Hamada, made comments after a Saturday visit to Manbij, declaring the Kurdish YPG the main terrorist organization within the SDF. The poison danger in the back of the revolution. And so we will see what happens, but it does seem like the Al-Qaeda rebels are preparing to go to war against with the SDF. And I guess we could dust off some headlines from 2015, 2016 with the CIA-backed Syrian jihadists fighting against the Pentagon-backed Syrian Kurds. All right, next up here, U.S. launches more airstrikes in Syria, claims 12 ISIS fighters killed. U.S. Central Command said Monday that its forces launched airstrikes in Syria, claiming it attacks against ISIS camps and killed 12 ISIS fighters. CENTCOM said in a press release that the strikes were conducted as a part of the ongoing mission to disrupt, degrade, and defeat ISIS, preventing the terrorist group from conducting external operations to ensure that ISIS does not seek opportunities to reconstitute in central Syria. It said that the airstrikes were launched against targets in areas previously controlled by Russia and the Assad, who fled the country following the takeover of Damascus by HTS, an offshoot of al-Qaeda. Since Assad's downfall, the U.S., Turkey, and Israel have all been bombing Syria. On December 8th, the day Assad fled, the U.S. launched heavy airstrikes in Syria, hitting 75 ISIS-related targets. U.S. officials justify the strikes by saying they don't want ISIS to reconstitute itself following the regime change. But on the other hand, the U.S. supported HTS's takeover, even though the group is designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization and has a similar ideology to ISIS. The U.S. also made it clear it has no intention of withdrawing the approximately 900 troops that it has occupying eastern Syria. The U.S. uses ISIS as an excuse to stay in Syria, but the presence is more about keeping Iran out of the area. And so the last thing I want to mention on this article is I think it's at least suspicious that the day after Assad goes, we have 75 al-Qaeda targets to hit, and in the weeks following, we have hundreds more. If we really knew that there were this many ISIS fighters in Syria, why didn't we strike them before? And the answer is pretty clear. It's because before, the ISIS fighters were a thorn in the side of Bashar al-Assad in Russia. And now the ISIS fighters may be a thorn in the side of HTS, in which case those are the kind of terrorists that we like in Syria. And so we're bombing ISIS to help them out. Rather disgusting policy when you think about it. Next up here, Israeli strikes on Western Syria cause massive blast. So Israel launched heavy airstrikes against targets in Western Syria's Tartus region overnight Sunday into Monday, causing a massive explosion, including one so big that it registered as a 3.1 magnitude earthquake on the Richter scale. A correspondent for Al Mayadeen reported that the strikes targeted weapons depots in Tartus, and residents reported feeling an earthquake-like tremors following the bombardment. Al Mayadeen reported that several civilians were killed by Israel's bombardment on the coastal region, but the number is unclear. According to the Syrian-based Observatory for Human Rights, they were the heaviest strikes in the region since 2012. The Israeli attacks were a part of the more than 800 airstrikes that Israel has conducted in Syria since former President Assad was thrown out of power. On top of the massive air campaign, Israel has also invaded southern Syria, capturing land in a buffer zone separating Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and areas beyond that buffer zone pushing towards Damascus. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu celebrated and took credit for the regime change since Assad was an ally of Iran and Hezbollah, but insisted that Israel needs to keep bombing Syria and occupying its land due to threats coming from the country. The U.S. has backed Israel's land grab in Syria, framing it as a defensive action. Abu Mohammed al-Jawlani, the leader of al-Qaeda-linked HTS, which has taken over Syria, said he does not see conflict with Israel. He said Israel no longer has a justification to bomb Syria since Iran and Hezbollah no longer have a foothold, but something tells me that's not going to stop the Israeli bombing. Next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, December 16th, antiwar.com. U.S. says it launched airstrikes on Houthi command and control facility in Yemen. So U.S. Central Command said Monday that it launched an airstrike on Yemen, claiming to target a Houthi command and control facility in the capital of Sana'a. On December 16th, Yemen time, U.S. Central Command forces conducted a precision airstrike against a key command and control facility operated by the Iran-backed Houthis within Houthi-controlled areas of Sana'a, Yemen, CENTCOM said in a press release, adding the targeted facility was a hub for coordinating Houthi operations, such as attacks against U.S. Navy warships and merchant vessels in the southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. A correspondent for Al Mayadeen in Yemen said the strikes targeted the Ministry of Defense in Sana'a and described it as American-British aggression, although the U.S. gave no indication that the UK was involved. A day earlier, Yemeni media reported that joint U.S.-British strikes on Yemen's northern Hajj province. The latest U.S. attack on Yemen comes amid reports that Israel is considering launching significant strikes against the Houthis, who have continued to launch attacks against Israel and Israeli-linked shipping despite nearly a year-long bombing campaign. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, said Monday that Yemeni forces launched a missile at Israel in response to the ongoing massacres against our brothers in Gaza. The missile force carried out a military operation targeting a military target in the Israeli enemy-occupied Haifa area using a Palestinian 2 hypersonic missile, the group said in a statement. In January 2024, President Biden launched a new bombing campaign against the Houthis in defense of Israeli shipping. The UK joined the US for several rounds of significant strikes on Yemen, but the bombing only escalated the situation in the Red Sea as the Houthis began targeting American and British shipping in response. Israel has launched 2 rounds of airstrikes against the Houthis in recent months, which have killed a total of 11 civilians, according to numbers from the Yemen Data Project. Israel's Khan broadcaster reported Monday that Israel was planning a major offensive against the Houthis in response to recent missile and drone attacks. From 2015 until 2022, the U.S. supported a Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis, which involved heavy airstrikes and a blockade. The Houthis only became a more capable fighting force during that time. According to the UN, that war killed at least 377,000 people, with more than half dying due to starvation and disease caused by the Saudi and US enforced siege. A ceasefire between the Houthis and Saudis held relatively well since April of 2022, but new U.S. sanctions are blocking an implementation of a lasting peace deal and the full lifting of those sanctions. And I just wanted to mention this last week. The House passed the massive $895 billion National Defense Authorization Act for 2025. We don't have to go into the whole thing. I just want to note here that was voted 281 to 40, with 124 Democrats voting against a provision banning the coverage of certain transgender-related treatments for children of service members, and so that seems to be the major issue, of course, not the actual military budget. We'll talk more about the NDAA as it continues to move through the Senate, but particularly once it gets to conference committee, because that's really where we get all the details of what's actually going to be in the NDAA. All right, thank you all so much for tuning into the show. And just one last quick reminder, if you're still listening, head on over, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. It really helps me out. I really appreciate it, and you'll get to see the episode that we put out later today. Thanks, everyone.